Hi, I am Dr. Scott.
And I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And this is LA Not So Confidential, the forensic psychology and true crime podcast.
Each week, we explore the intersection of psychology, the criminal justice system, and entertainment.
Today, our episode is on the forensic psych topic of scared straight and reform schools.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to LA Not So Confidential. It is good to see you, Dr. Scott. We're moving right through our really hot summer. Why do we always pick like 1 PM to record?
I don't know, but like
my family hates me. They're over it.
But what's funny is like as warm as it is, like my little recording Harry Potter closet here is actually one of the coolest places in the apartment, which is
that's
awesome.
Good.
So
that's good. Yeah, I'm like, all right, everybody, time to move to the back of the house.
Yeah,
might not want to be up here. Turning the house fan off, turning the air off.
Oh, right.
You know,
right.
I got to do all of that crap. So yet again,
we just need to build you a smaller little booth that's all completely insulated, and there's like one little sliver of a vent that pushes in air.
Okay, so what about this? My husband's getting ready to retire in a few months. What if I have him, instead of like a she shed, like build me a little podcast shed studio outside?
Why don't you guys you got so much property, move in a tiny home, move in a 390 square foot tiny home, take the back bedroom and, insulate it. You can always, and then, you can Airbnb it to BDSM people that want a playroom.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Totally. Yeah. Look, it's going to be a moneymaker.
Just because we talked about BDSM on
now it's going to be a recurring thing.
Come on.
But I wanted to, I have to repeat what I told you before we started recording, which is really funny because of our schedule today. Like we thought it might be early in the morning or it might be late in the afternoon. So here we are in the middle of the day. And I was like, I had all these errands to run, but that's okay. So let me just hang here at home until we're ready to go. And I plowed through 6 little assignments, things that have been on my to-do list. 2 of them had been on my to-do list for 5 freaking years.
Can you give us an example? Because I need to know like what would be on your list for 5 years you never got to. And I get like you've moved, so maybe that's opened the opportunity to address it.
Right.
But like what?
This was reconciling an account.
Those are the worst.
Just download like one PDF, compare it against Quicken, and it's done. And I've worried about it and been so frustrated, but I just never did it. And then the other thing, the thing I think that sprung all this, that got me started, was I made a commitment on my flight to visit family last week that I was going to take my flight from LA to Dallas, and it was going to be nothing but cleaning out my inbox. So I went from 4,600 emails down to 900.
What?
I know. It's just ridiculous. It's the total ADHD thing. And, thank God for filtering where you can filter it by from. And it's like, okay, I've got literally 15 from Vanity Fair, 15 from, news organizations or catalogs.
Yeah.
But those other things today, I knocked out in less than an hour and a half. Took me no stress. When I was done, I was like, I worried about those, not getting them done. Yeah. If I had just been on top of it, it's all done. It took me a total of 45 minutes. I will learn nothing from this. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
So everyone, 5 years, mark this date on your calendar. Scott will be talking about all the shit he just did.
No. I'm a changed man. I'm going to be evangelical about it now. I'm going to stay on top of all this. Yeah. Anyway.
On this thread, since we're talking about, not this thread, totally different thread, but at the top, you and I were also talking about doing an upcoming bonus episode to kind of continue the conversation about those who want to pursue forensic psychology. So, way long time ago, we did our So You Want to Be a Forensic Psychologist episode. We want to update that just with questions and paths and tons of obstacles that people have told us about,
that people are not aware of. And we thought that we had been pretty explicit about what the challenges are, and apparently we weren't. Or
when you have programs trying to sell diplomas that aren't going to get you anything, it's hard to know that. And so I think some people have fallen into that. But please send us your questions if you are thinking about this route. We're happy to add it to the list and address it in that sort of part 2, if you will, about forensic psychology and pursuing that.
This is one of the ones where we will be probably tripling our amount of hashtags for, because really there's so many different ways that this can be promoted that's outside the genre of true crime. Because
totally.
And we'll get into it in the episode when we come to it. But you and I have had these ongoing conversations where it's frustrating, where You overhear somebody making a decision. And it's like, well, like you were saying, your Starbucks experience. I overheard this conversation. Do I tell this person? Do I wave my hands with, warning flags of like, this is what the reality is? But you can't. That's going to be 90 minutes of your time explaining it to somebody
I don't want
who may
my
not
iced
appreciate
coffee to get hot.
Exactly.
All right.
Okay. So last episode recap, we covered another infamous young woman who was imprisoned at the Tehachapi State Prison here in California in the 1920s and 1930s. She was incarcerated with the likes of Burma White, the Rattlesnake Lady, and Clara Phillips, baby killer Erna Janicek. We explored her family history, her developmental background, and the stressors present in her life that led to her decision to take the life of a child within her care. Please listen to it if you get a chance. We are going to do a couple of more from this time period that are particularly integral to this case and the others of the women who were in that prison at the same time. So this is a way to get caught up on them. So you're ready for our next episode.
Yeah. It's like, all the characters of Melrose Place, AKA Tehachapi State Prison.
Exactly. Yes.
So our episode today, as we mentioned in the intro, is Scared Straight Reform Schools. And this is a suggestion by a listener. Dear Charlie from Facebook a gazillion years ago suggested this, and I have had it on the list. So Charlie, sorry for the delay, but we finally got your idea done. And it is a very fascinating subject. And just know, we do take your suggestions and we throw them on a document, even if we never answer you, which we usually do.
Yeah.
But they are there and they give us inspiration sometimes when we're looking for stuff to cover. But the way various cultures and societies have handled juvenile aberrant or escalating behaviors crosses a wide spectrum of interventions. And of course, we've started an exploration of how these quote unquote interventions and approaches have gone horribly wrong through the decades.
Yeah.
So big warning here. We're going to be talking about child abuse, both physical, sexual, and just some really horrific accounts. I mean, I feel like I use the word horrific all the time on this podcast, but these are cruel and unusual. And some of it is going to verge on torture, really. Yeah. So be warned, guys.
This is an interesting, fascinating subject. And I can imagine that it would be triggering to individuals who may have had this particular experience in their life. So I encourage everyone to please be careful with this. And something that's different in the presentation of our material today is that while, Dr. Shiloh and I work very hard to be victim centric and not glorify killers or perpetrators, this is an incidence where we're pulling from news reports of people who have come forward about these reform schools, about these wilderness camps. So we're starting off with an example using a young woman's name, and we're going to be referring you very, very heavily, encouraging you to read our resource material on our resource page, because the articles are fascinating and people need to know that this shit happens. You need to know in your community, wherever you live in the US, that this could be happening just outside your city limits. So at age 16, Rowan Bissett was transported against her will from her Jacksonville, Florida home across state lines to Utah by men, and I say men loosely, that she did not know. This was the first time that she'd ever left her home state, and what she found later is that these men were hired by her parents to take her directly from the psychiatric hospital where she had been hospitalized under the Baker Act. That is the state of Florida's Welfare and Institutions Code for a psychiatric hold of 72 hours. Rowan had struggled for years with depression and self-harm, and following her stabilization at the hospital, she was now terrified. For several years, she'd been in therapy twice a week, and she was continuing to struggle. And what comes out later in Rowan's story is a number of issues of what was contributing to her depression and her challenges. Her parents had discovered the possibility of an out-of-state wilderness camp, and they were sold on the brochure that promised wonderful results for their daughter's mental health challenges. The program was located in Wingate, Utah, a tiny desert town where temperatures rise above 100 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the summer and drop to 40 below at night. And this article is about 6 years old, so I'm sure that 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Utah has probably gone up by 10 or 15 degrees.
Yeah,
Not
probably.
Pleasant. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm already having a reaction off the bat that she was stabilized and now this is what's going to happen to
Right.
her.
Right.
Oh my gosh. So Rowan knew something was wrong from the very minute she was picked up. The two other men on either side of her and the staff driving the van were just a few years older than her. They laughed at her for vomiting up the Wendy's burger that they had purchased for her due to the bumpiness of the van. And within a few days, Rowan was part of a group of 10 teenagers forced to hike while carrying a 40-pound backpack. She was not used at all to this type of physical exertion, and she knew immediately that this was too much for her body. She refused to hike and sat on the ground. After she said, "I'm just going to sit here." And they replied, "You can sit here all day long." We had someone sit here for 27 days and eventually they gave up. No one gets out. So Rowan got up. Over the next months, she and her peers were forced to hike anywhere from half a mile to 15 miles a day in the desert heat. They'd be forced to set up camp and given small amounts of food to survive on for the week. She reports that she was given 2 packs of tuna per week for her protein allowance, and she often felt weak from overexertion, overheating, and lack of nutrition. As a hiker, I'm like, 2 cans of tuna is like what you might need for a morning hike.
Well, and I don't hike nearly as much as you do, but, the yearly hikes I do in the Smokies, which is a relatively cool hike. I mean, temperature wise is a cool hike in the middle of summer because you're surrounded by trees and you have to eat because, and this is only 5.5 miles up a mountain, but we're already talking about abuse right here. It's abuse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Additionally, her sleeping bag was weighted at night by a heavy tarp with 5-gallon containers of water on each corner. So she was told that this was to keep her from escaping. Basically, they're pinning her down to sleep. And the claustrophobia that this caused from her not being able to move during the night later led to a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and more immediately daily panic attacks for her.
So this experience was supposed to help Rowan move away from her chronic self-harm, but the stress that the camp laid on her made it worse. And Rowan used every method that she could for harming herself, including violently scratching her arms or cutting with any implement that she could find. The staff then began using what are called therapeutic holds. As a community health worker, I myself am trained in therapeutic holds. That's a nice way of saying restraining someone very, very tightly, and it's not comfortable at all. It's usually done for people who are acting out violently. This is just a very fancy way of renaming basically containing and restraining someone, whether it uses your own body force, your arms, or implements such as ropes, mattresses, blankets. Either way, it's only supposed to be done by highly trained individuals. One day, a staff member held her in a restraint position for so long that she cried and sobbed for hours. She reports that he was one of the nicer guys that she had met at this program and told her at one point that he had chosen to do this work because he genuinely wanted to help others. So while Rowan sobbed, being forced into a constraint position that he was taught to implement on the other campgoers, he apologized over and over, himself growing more and more upset. He would repeat, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I don't know how else to stop you from hurting yourself. This is what they taught us." Rowan was also sexually assaulted by a male staff member, and the group accountability sessions that the camp forced on them focused on her emerging sexuality, consistently telling her that her same-sex attractions were a sin. Rowan was at this time identifying as a lesbian. Wilderness camps are an example of the modern day reform school. So despite what the voice of true crime genre would have you think, the landscape of youth crime in the United States has experienced a significant shift over the years. Most notably, since the 1990s, there has been a statistically validated and observed decline in youth crime rates. You wouldn't know that because social media, TikTok, Facebook feeds just shows you. And of course, I watch those, so it's in my algorithm.
Right.
And all I see now is just like people freaking out, people like robbing stores and running out. But statistically, we know that it actually has gone down. The trend has motivated many communities and areas within the United States to reevaluate their approach to juvenile justice, particularly the completely over-the-top punitive practices that escalated in use during the 1980s and 1990s. Now there's a focus on major comprehensive changes within these systems with the aim of diminishing reliance on what was called institutional confinement and phasing out methods and modalities that basically have been around for over 100 years. It's a model of reform schools, replacing that with the expansion of community-centered interventions.
Well, I think on the, face, that sounds great. Unfortunately, this all sounds a bit too familiar, right? The community responsibility for those released from the mental institutions in the 80s all across the country, and California being really hard hit.
Right.
In that sense.
California started it, basically. California was the domino effect across the country. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. This doesn't need to be history repeating itself.
No, it doesn't. Again, what we're talking about today throughout this episode is people putting Band-Aids on head wounds rather than thinking about institutional change on a foundational level that has to do more with sociology than it does psychology, really. Totally, it has to do with community change and community support. There's always a lack of foresight in these stories. If a minor broke the law in the late 18th or 19th centuries, the legal response would be to confine them in jails or prisons. With no real alternatives, the minors, regardless of their age or gender, would find themselves in prison side by side with hardened adult criminals, as well as inmates that were diagnosed with significant levels of mental illness. Without a doubt, these jails or prisons were overcrowded, dilapidated, completely inadequate in addressing the unique needs that minors have, as well as young adults who may be adult in age and body, but still emotionally are dealing with childhood issues. So it's also noted by the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice League that there was a phenomenon emerging parallel to the incarceration of minors, and that was the substantial escalation of child poverty rates and child neglect rates within urban American cities. It did not escape city leaders, who then sought to create solutions to this emerging problem. However, of course, their efforts made many, many mistakes along the way.
Yeah. So let's go back to the early 1800s when an up-and-coming attorney from New York, James W. Gerard, was defending a 14-year-old who got caught stealing a bird. And Gerard managed to convince the court that this kid would end up being a full-on thief, basically for the rest of his life, if he got thrown in with adult troublemakers. And thanks to Gerard's perspective on juvenile punishment, the Society for the Reformation of Juvenile Delinquents in New York went ahead and set up the House of Refuge in 1825. So this was America's very first place to try and straighten out wayward young souls. So this being the first institution designed specifically to accommodate the destitute, vagrant, and economically disadvantaged youth, it was really trying to look at these issues of delinquents who had been found guilty of crimes or maybe were susceptible to this type of trouble, and looking at the different goals of what was going on here. So really taking a look at okay, these aren't just short adults. Like I always say,
right.
We need to do something different here.
There's got to be other factors there, right?
Yeah. So these efforts had the goal of challenging the confinement of youth in what had been adult penal institutions and advocating for the establishment of facilities that would specifically address the concerns of a younger citizen that had to be quote unquote punished for breaking the law.
So the first of these was called the House of Refuge, and it was the foundation that would eventually evolve into the modern juvenile justice system. And within 3 years of its establishment, similar organizations and institutions were founded in Boston and Philadelphia. Then within a few years more, approximately 25 additional facilities sprouted across the United States. But of course, with all good intentions, the planning was not fully thought out or considered, as these institutions and the movements behind them lacked a real understanding of the big picture. Visually, you can look up these places on Wikipedia. The pictures are both fascinating and horrifying because it would be imposing Game of Thrones type structures, like huge brick buildings, stone buildings with towers and turrets that almost look like castles, like medieval and foreboding. We'd probably find buildings like this in horror movies. And they were located sometimes in the middle of urban centers, ostensibly for convenience, right? And the aim would be to house abandoned, delinquent, or difficult to manage youth. And while most were designed to house and treat approximately 200 young individuals, some, like the New York House of Refuge, had a population at times of over 1,000 individuals.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I wonder, yes, of course, convenience for it to be right there and maybe parents or guardians to be able to visit. But I also think it was kind of, let's put this behemoth of a institution that looks horrifying in the middle of the city as a warning to other youths. So it's like a scared straight tactic in and of itself.
Yeah, could be.
So already you can see where this is going. And within a few years, these institutions encountered many of the same challenges plaguing adult jails and prisons, including overcrowding, deteriorating conditions, and instances of really serious staff misconduct. And at the same time that this movement was happening, the public school movement was happening, gaining momentum in larger urban areas. And the existing social reformers emphasized a new vision of society that emphasized education. This movement then converged with the refuge movement to evolve into the creation of reform schools. And they were also known as training and industrial schools. And those then later evolved into what we now recognize as youth correctional institutions. So the evolution here of these facilities went from refuge to reform and education, back to where we were trying to get kids away from, the concentration of a large number of youth within highly regimented prison-like settings.
Now let's get to one of our main points today, Scared Straight programs. For those of you that don't remember this, Scared Straight was a program that was aimed at deterring juvenile delinquency by exposing those that were considered to be at-risk youth to the quote unquote harsh realities of prison life. And it absolutely did not yield the intended outcomes for several reasons. In the 1970s, inmates serving life sentences at a prison in New Jersey were asked to initiate a program to deter at-risk or delinquent children from a future life of crime. So, first of all, research has consistently shown that fear-based tactics such as those employed by Scared Straight often led to short-term compliance rather than long-term behavior change. So what you're doing is you're exposing a child to shock and intimidation, and that may temporarily deter them from criminal activities. But in the long run, this effect tends to diminish over time as the fear wears off. The way the human psyche works is it almost acts as a vaccination, right?
Yeah.
So you get exposed to this like person screaming in your face, telling you like you're a worthless piece of shit. Do you think you want to live like this? You think you can hack it in here? So it's horrifying at the beginning. And then the fear diminishes over time as their defense mechanisms internally start to kick in. So basically, you're inoculating these children against the reality that the inmates were trying to communicate to them. There's also a lot of evidence that leads to showing that these inmates may have said they were doing it to help kids out, but it was completely inappropriate. Like the over-the-top screaming and in your face and physical threatening was more of a show. And it seems like a lot of the prisoners that were engaged in it they were kind of getting off on it. If you look back at the YouTube videos, it's pretty clear that they're enjoying themselves. So the Department of Justice stated in their crime prevention research review, even though research has indicated that deterrence-based programs such as Scared Straight are not effective, jurisdictions across the country continue to use them because, of course, reasons.
Yeah.
That's all I'll say.
Reasons. I don't know.
Yeah. There they are.
This reminds me, there would be times when I was working as a cop that parents would come into the lobby with their little kids and be like, hey, they did like this little thing wrong. Can you like take them in the back and like, tell them why they shouldn't do this and tell them that they might be going to jail and like show them the jail cells? I'm like, no.
Hey, can you traumatize my kid for me?
Can you parent your kid?
Yeah. Like, can you parent your kid?
That's not something we do.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. But yeah, I've heard of like parents setting up for like the police to come and sort of like fake arrest their kid. I mean, nothing that my department ever did. And I certainly hope this isn't happening in most areas,
I think unfortunately, though, it does happen. I'm sure it does happen. Yeah.
Yeah. But same thing, right? You're trying to like scare a pattern of behavior into them that is just, it's not going to be long term. So second here, Scared Straight encounters provide a distorted and sensationalized view of prison life too. It's lacking the nuanced understanding of the complex factors that contributed to criminal behavior to begin with. And by focusing solely on the intimidating aspects of incarceration, the program completely fails to address the underlying social, psychological, and economic factors that drive juvenile delinquency, which then completely ignores the factors that contributes to how the teen got to this point in their lives at all. So the very narrow approach really overlooked the need for comprehensive and individualized interventions that target the root causes of criminal behavior.
Yes.
And lastly, about Scared Straight programs and sort of interventions, these inadvertently glamorized criminal behavior and then reinforce negative peer dynamics. So that's completely wanting to have one goal and ending up with just about the opposite there. The exposure
for some kids, I think it was probably inspirational. Like, look how badass this person is. If you get in somebody's face and scream long enough, they're going to back down. That's the lesson that was learned.
Yeah, totally. So the exposure to older, seemingly toughened inmates could inadvertently create a sense of, like you're saying, admiration or even intrigue, like just curiosity from it. And that would lead some participants to romanticize a criminal lifestyle rather than deterring them from it. Unintended consequences glamorized and made a joke of inmates and the troubled teens, shifting focus away from evidence-based approaches that focus on things like rehabilitation, education, and addressing the multifaceted challenges faced by at-risk youth. So this then morphs into a trope and making these poor teens like the butt of the joke.
Yes, even today, comedy shows, which of course I devour, like SNL, In Living Color, Mad TV, to mention, a sort of 20-year, 30-year span of shows, all have done a version of Scared Straight that are just completely hilarious. I mean, even I can still watch the late Chris Farley doing his
oh my gosh,
his
so
motivational
good.
Speaker to the two pothead teens.
Right.
And I just think I'm ready to pack it all in. Shiloh, we should just pack it all in and go live in a van down by the river, right?
No, he scares me.
If you haven't seen it, it was Christina Applegate.
Oh, that's
was the guest host. She and David Spade were playing teenagers that Chris Farley was trying to warn them against the life of pot smoking. And he's so unbelievably funny that the two of them cannot stop laughing. It's genius. It is just genius.
It really is. Oh my gosh. But I distinctly remember in the 80s and 90s, this constant flow of teens being brought onto the talk show circuit.
Oh, yeah.
And then the drill sergeants coming out, yelling at them that in their face, obviously like so showy. But, the parent would come in with the teen and here's my troubled teen and da-da-da-da-da. And then, Jerry Springer or Maury Povich, whoever is like, all right, bring out the drill instructors. And they would yell at them there. Then they would take them to these reform schools. And then I remember footage of them being filmed, there, and then they would play it back for the audience. I mean, it's just horrible, like just awful. I mean, you and I have talked about these talk shows and some of the exploitation that happens, but this just was like seared into my brain and not in a Scared Straight way. It was just like, that seems like that shouldn't be happening to these kids.
Well, I think we have a broader and more profound view of that, not only as clinicians, but our culture starts to look at it, that's just not going to work. And I would add another facet to it, that while there are some crappy parents out there, there are absolutely some crappy parents out there that absolutely laid the groundwork for their kids to be little assholes. I get that. But there's also something else that, like, regardless of how the behavior originated, the parents, even if they were crappy parents, are now in a position where they're terrified, right? Mm-hmm. They feel hopeless. They feel helpless. They have no facility whatsoever to take back control of this situation, to help their children prosper. And so they're going to take it to a talk show. And then there's another aspect of what has really come to light in the last decade is all those shows like Jerry Springer, Maury Povich, whoever, The Bodyguard, Steve Wilkos, whatever. Yeah. Like, the vast majority of the people that come on those shows came on because it was an experience. They were lying, they were told to exaggerate. For many of them, it was the first time they'd ever traveled outside their hometown. So they get a plane ride, they get a first, 4-star hotel room, they get star treatment for 3 days or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's a really unethical and immoral system that used this as fodder. And then the really sickening thing is to think that these kids were getting abused, like they were moving them into a position where they were definitely going to get exposed to abuse.
Yeah. And in front of a camera essentially. But over the years, we've also heard about celebrity adolescents being sent to reform schools for various problems, right? Addiction, wild behavior, or to just kind of quietly straighten them out, take them out of the public eye for a little bit, generally framed as for their own good. But I can't also help but think that it's really about the fact that they're moneymakers for themselves and a lot of other people.
Right.
Other people's careers are on the line with child stars. And, I don't think there was a lot talked about until the celebrity we're going to talk about right now coming forward with it, of just what atrocities were happening.
Yeah. So the example that we use for today to start with that is of that status is Paris Hilton. And she was really the first celebrity to speak publicly about her experience. She talks about her experience in the recent documentary, This Is Paris. And what she reveals is that at the age of 17, she was sent to Provo Canyon School in Utah. Utah, are we seeing a theme here? And she lived there for a year until she turned 18. And in the documentary, Paris is interviewed along with others who attended the reform school at the same time. They revealed that the students were subject to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as being forced to take medication and subjected to solitary confinement. Paris specifically recounts being taken screaming from her bed by two men in the middle of the night and transported to Provo Canyon School. She was vulnerable in revealing that she still suffers from recurring nightmares and trust issues that have resulted in other longstanding post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So it's very easy, I think, for people to discount individuals of Miss Hilton's stature and status and history. Her career is built on a certain level of what did Oprah Winfrey used to call them, celebutantes rather than celebrities. Right. She'd only done a couple of movies. It's not like she really had a career. She had the reality show afterwards. But this is one of those examples that even in what that narrative that I just shared with you folks, there's already a problem. It's the same problem that we talk about with Rowan in our opening example. You cannot force medication on children unless it hits a specific set of criteria. And that is they are acting out of control and are presenting as a danger to themselves or a danger to others. It doesn't matter that they're not adults. You can't do that. And the person who okays that, the psychiatrist or the medical doctor that okays that, should be held liable. It is not surprising at all that these are taking place in Utah, across state lines, out in the fucking middle of nowhere, where they're just writing their own rules as they go. What's amazing to me, and there are a lot of lawsuits about these, but it's amazing that there aren't more lawsuits.
I know, especially with, the pedigree of like really powerful people with money whose kids have been victims and survivors. Interestingly, Paris Jackson, daughter of Michael Jackson, also came forward as a survivor after Hilton told her story. And Jackson reported that she was sent to a behavior modification boarding school for nearly 2 years when she was a teen. And she's been open on her, mostly through social media, about her diagnosis of PTSD as a result. And this was at a place called Diamond Ranch Academy in Utah.
Another one. Yeah. So I think it's fair to say, though, or we're sort of bound to say that not all experiences have been like this. And another celebrity who I adore and used to wait on when I was a waiter at California Pizza Kitchen decades ago, she would come in and she was the coolest, sweetest, best tipper, really good tipper. I was not her favorite waiter, though. I was like, she was really close to Steve. Steve was wonderful. And I got to wait on her a couple of times. Drew Barrymore did have Hilton on her talk show to discuss the atrocities at Provo Canyon and discussed her own experiences. Now, about the facility that Barrymore went to, she said, I have to tell you, the people at my place were really good. I mean, I didn't like being thrown in solitary confinement. I will say that I was very rebellious. I started riots there all the time. And there were a lot of other kids like me. And my mom just didn't know what to do with me. I was doing drugs. I was out of control. She just threw her hands up and threw me in there, not knowing where else to turn to. And that place really did help me. And it did save my life. And I actually wouldn't change a thing.
Yeah.
So I do think, though, that there is a little bit of difference. I mean, I love that Drew Barrymore is so incredibly authentic. I mean, she's just a really authentic individual.
Yes.
I mean, and it shows. I mean, people, I kind of get like a little defensive of her because I think people make fun of her and her wanting to like get really close to the people that she interviews physically and sit on the floor with them. And I just think that, you know, she is trying to establish intimacy and share authentic stories, and she's being honest about herself. But she also, in that quote, I mean, she goes on later to reveal a little bit more, but for those that don't know, you know, Drew Barrymore was a rocketing child star from a very early age. And her mother, I'm sorry if this insults you, Drew, but you've talked about this before, her mother's a piece of work.
Yeah.
And she was exposed to a number of substance use opportunities, including going out to like Studio 54. Like, what fucking doorman let a child into a nightclub where like literally cocaine was just like thrown off balconies? I mean, it's insane. Yeah.
I know, what a life. And like, I just picture little Drew Barrymore starting a riot, and it's like the cutest thing in my head, even though it's like a really serious matter.
She'd have like flower barrettes in her hair,
right?
And like a sundress, and she'd be the baddest ass of them all.
Totally. Yes, exactly. No, I'm glad we offset that with, you know, a different experience and someone who's like, yeah, it was rough, but you know what? I was rough and I needed it. And it's got me to where I am today. And clearly she's just done so much really, really good work on herself.
Right.
I also want to bring up, I highly recommend the UCP podcast, The Lost Kids, with host and investigative journalist Josh Block, who is, his work in the podcast world and true crime is just incredible, very just top notch. And this 6-part true crime series explores the history of Sea-Doo Running Springs. So Sea-Doo is an organization in and of itself, but this one particularly took place in Running Springs, which is just up here in the San Bernardino Mountains from us. And this is the story of Daniel Yuen, who disappeared after escaping from the program 16 years ago, and he's never been found. It's really, really heartbreaking to hear how the parents truly believe that they were doing the best thing for their child. And like you said, were at their wits' end, didn't know what else to do. And they were sold a bill of goods by a con man who just completely marketed his program towards desperate parents like them. So Sea-Doo was founded in 1967 by Mel Wasserman, and they really capitalized on the troubled teen industry. The company owned and operated several what they called therapeutic boarding schools, licensed as group homes, wilderness therapy programs, and behavior modification programs in California and Idaho. And the company's schools have faced numerous allegations of abuse over the years. Thankfully, Sea-Doo went out of business in 2005 amidst, you know, a lot of lawsuits and just sort of state regulatory crackdowns that finally brought them to a close. But go listen to The Lost Kids. It's fantastic. And it really covers the history and the rampantness of this company's abuse on kids.
So let's talk a little bit about the research on quote unquote troubled teens and the causes of behavior. So look, here's a reality break for anybody. The majority of teenagers are going to act out negatively to their parents, their peers, their authority figures, and even themselves in some ways that are not chronic or severe. Again, actions that come out of the natural process of an individual who begins what we call individuating from the family. They become their own person. They explore their own identity. However, when those behaviors do become chronic, they do become severe, and they're a reflection of self-care or a decreasing ability to navigate life, the behaviors can be due to profoundly complex issues with their mental health. I said can. Doesn't mean they are. It can be a number of other factors, but it also can be emerging from mental health, developmental issues, or family issues. Moving beyond the accepted levels of identity development that comes from challenging parental authority, which is completely normal. Escalations of irritability, anger, and impulsivity can be the outward expression of the challenges that they face with anxiety, depression, trauma, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, body dysmorphia, substance addiction, and escalating exposure to social media.
And as we've discussed in many previous episodes, the challenges of today's teens far outweighs that of previous generations. As we've also said ad nauseum, the stress to just humans outweighs what it's ever been before. But this is due to the increasing levels of stress in the modern world at large, whether that stems from, like you said, social media, personal challenges, or maybe the family dynamic inside the home. But what causes teens to act out or resort to crime, there are some risk factors or some points here that we can look at. So definitely violence at home has found to contribute to acting out. So this is the exposure to violence in the parental or guardian roles that are in the home. So some intimate partner violence there, or some criminal discipline, perhaps if there's criminal activity being exhibited by the parents or the guardians in the home, then that exposure. And I think we talked about that in the criminal siblings episode,
yes.
right? Just being exposed to it can then sort of create, exactly, normalizes it. Also, another factor that we find is lack of moral guidance and supervision. So moral guidance does not have to be attached to anything spiritual or a religious belief system. The concept of the good enough parent holds strong, and kids who are neglected, abandoned, or provided with wildly contradicting emotional experiences with their parents will have usually some difficulty navigating the world. So what we're saying is, like, you don't have to be the perfect parent.
Absolutely not.
Not at all. But there is a point where those scales tip into neglect and abandonment and abuse, where there is that lack of quote unquote moral guidance or supervision just being completely absent. And then also is poor educational quality. So teachers, administrators, and school systems face a number of challenges in providing youth with necessary skill sets, foundational learning, critical thinking. And again, this is due to a number of factors, not to educators' lack of ability, but I'm even just thinking, I heard a statistic today that post-COVID, the attendance rate in Los Angeles County of kids in schools has dipped so low, meaning like absence rate, I should say, has really been at its highest point. It's like it didn't really recover from doing school at home. And there seems to be a more lackadaisical mindset about kids being there consistently with really good attendance records. They also found that it's preliminary information in the research, but there's been higher numbers of illnesses aside from COVID. So I think, you can always say your kid is sick. It doesn't mean that's accurate, but I wonder if it's like the easy thing to say now that we're in a sort of a post-COVID world or people are just being more cautious. Like, I just don't want my kid to go to school when I would normally send them to school hacking and sneezing all over the place.
It could be. And I mean, I would say also, like, that in itself, that example is not a bad thing of people not sending your kid to school when they're just literally on death's door, which we used to all the time. Like, sure, you only stayed home if you were like on death's door. But that actually has profound impact on the community. It's like if you don't send your kid to school when they're sick, then they don't infect a whole bunch of kids who then go and infect the rest of the family. But I'm sorry, I want to make sure that our listeners understand that we're not saying that the educators are being lackadaisical. We're talking about whether the kids are not motivated to come to school and they convince their parents, or the parents have become lackadaisical, or they have their own reasons.
Indeed.
So, that's part of it. And there's also, people forget that there's momentum. School has momentum. The more you're there, the more you're engaged, the more that you see there are opportunities for social activities, for clubs, for all these things that you can do. And when you're separated from it, it loses momentum. So that is the next factor, along with poor educational quality, is poor school performance. So if there's poor school performance, there's less motivation to engage 100% or even 75% in your educational process. There's also the exposure of substance use. Kids as young as middle school have access to drugs, particularly cannabis. Cannabis has become pretty easily available on all schools levels, unfortunately. And peer pressure is, kids have a desire to conform as they're exploring their own identity, and they're kind of individuating from, I am not my parents, I am not my family, I am my family, but I'm not my family. Oh, I'm this community. I want to be part of this. And if there's one dominant personality or there's one dominant culture within that peer pressure group, then they're going to be more likely to succumb. And then also just clearly socioeconomic factors. People were so just not understanding why kids weren't fully engaging in online schooling. And it's like, hello, we have families in large urban areas that are 6 people living in a 1 bedroom or a 2 bedroom house. Where are they going to find the opportunity to do their work in a way that is conducive to learning? So there's just a lot of factors that can contribute to that.
If they have a device that can connect to the internet, I remember the stories of kids sitting outside Taco Bell trying to get a Wi-Fi signal.
Oh yeah.
During the pandemic, because it's still absolutely a luxury to have that connectivity in a lot of homes in this country.
Right.
So on the flip side, maybe we should talk about, just kind of normal teen behaviors, which they do seem like a different species. I get that. I know I'm going to be firsthand dealing with that pretty soon here.
Oh, yeah.
But things that are absolutely normal, and all of us can think back to when we were teens, were things like fluctuating moods, right? I mean, it sounds so nice and flowery to say it that way, but they can be like little Tasmanian devils. We're talking irrationality, impulsiveness, irritability, a lack of respect. Those are all normal within teens. And we're talking about within reason, of course. But again, this is that quest for self-discovery that can contribute to emotional highs and lows, as well as just biological basis for all of that going on too. Also, normal teen behaviors is their prioritization of peer relationships. So just because you as parents have been their only and most important people in their lives for so long, that will take a hard right at some point. And adolescents are inherently social beings and significantly influenced by their peer system. There is importance in their friends and peers' acceptance and perspectives as they navigate their positions in the world. And teens go through a long phase of prioritizing their peers over their adults and other family members in their lives, certainly. Also, expect some alterations in appearance.
Oh, yes.
So and this is I think this is like a really fun piece at this point with my kid. She's 11. If I look at pictures from a year and a half ago, I'm like, who is this kid? But while developing their identities, teenagers often experiment with their style of clothing, style of hair, and their speech, sometimes going for more daring or attention-seeking choices in all of these things, some of which are in huge contrast to their parents or their family. So, it's, again, I think it's just so normal, but all of these things can be things that are really taken personally, or maybe your mind goes to it being a little bit malicious when it really isn't even that conscious of a choice that they're doing it for these reasons that we're talking about. And then lastly, we have the desire for autonomy. Teens crave independence and self-awareness, and this is just a journey of discovery. Most of us all had this at some point because you've been so restricted, and for obvious reasons, safety and otherwise, that craving to be something more, to be older, to have this independence is absolutely natural.
Yeah. And it's also, if it's handled well, in the best case scenario, handling a teen's exploration of their identity, of their autonomy, and being patient with it allows them to come back on their own for security. It's sort of like the attachment exercises where they see toddlers go out and they'll explore their environment, but they always come back to mom or dad's leg where they can seek solace. But that's not to say, folks, we started out the show where this is focusing on reform schools, but we did want to give you this so that there's not just like this flat assumption about, well, they're all teen criminals, or they're all completely innocent and they're shoved into these places. We're not saying that these teens did not do things that were problematic. I think in Rowan's case, she's being pretty frank that she was struggling with her sexuality, and probably the emotional issues were emerging from that concern about how that would be accepted by her community. But there are other people that act out. And like part of my day-to-day work is sometimes telling parents, like, it is time to get your kid to a therapeutic community, which we won't talk about this time, but therapeutic communities are very, very different setups. They are setups where there's no restraint, but it is set up where there is a community effort and you have responsibilities to live. And every moment is like a therapeutic opportunity opportunity to learn how to engage with the world. And there are some very successful ones of those. But when we look at what does work in shaping adolescent behaviors, I want to refer to three really great researchers, Yeager, Dahl, and Dwick. They state in their research that traditional interventions fail when they do not align with adolescents' enhanced desire to feel respected and accorded status. However, interventions that do align with this desire can motivate internalized positive behavior change. So what we can learn from this is that as teens are struggling to develop their own identities apart from their parents and apart from as well as congruent with their peers, they have to be afforded basic levels of respect within the family unit. Loving and authoritative, not authoritarian parenting provides this. Now, I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page as you're listening to this, that when we refer to Yeager, Dahl, and Dwick's research, and they use the term respect, are we all defining respect the same way? Because there are cultural variations on what respect means. Sure. Respect, as defined by Merriam-Webster dictionary, is having recognition that another individual holds sentient human status in the same way that you do. Respect for some cultures only means who holds the power. And then the status also has its own set of definitions. Status due to what? Like somebody put a crown on my head, so you have to respect me. You have to recognize that I have more status than you. And within some cultures, when children become involved in peer communities that are just a step above Lord of the Flies, they may have a very, very different definition of what respect and status means.
Yes. So let's move into our criminal case here. We're just going to cover one because it's quite lengthy. And I think as we've given some examples and talked about the celebrity examples, we have two really good, well, maybe three really good entertainment representation examples. You're going to get the gist here. So this is the Florida Boys Reform School case. And in the year 1900, the Florida State Reform School for Boys opened up on 1,400 acres just west of Tallahassee. It was operated by the state of Florida, and at one point, it was the largest reform institution in the United States. The site was originally divided into two sub-campuses, the south side for white students and the north side for non-white students. Segregation ended at the school in the 60s, but at the opening and on through, this was the case. It has been called several names over the years, including the Florida Industrial School for Boys, and then the Dozier School for Boys. And throughout its history, the school was known for its harsh conditions and brutal treatment at the very least. In 1903, an inspection resulted in intel that children at the school were commonly kept in leg irons. And then in 1914, there was a fire in a dormitory that killed 6 students and 2 staff members. 4 years later, during the Spanish flu epidemic, 11 students were recorded as having died, but they were not named, lending to a long-standing tradition of secrecy around the deaths of children at the facility. The school was investigated by the state 6 times during its first 13 years of operation. So not off to a great start. And several periodic investigations and changes of leadership occurred over the years, but it seemed that little changed. One notable death in the 1930s was of a 13-year-old boy who was sent to the school for his crime of trespassing and died 38 days after arriving. But just before that, in the late 1920s, an 11-room concrete block detention building was constructed to house incorrigible or violent students who were already at the reform school. It contained 2 cells. Again, segregation was still in effect at this time, and students referred to it as the White House. And in the 1950s and 60s, it was the site of the most brutal beatings and some reports of actual torture of boys. Finally, in 1967, corporal punishment was officially abolished and the building was closed down and used for storage.
In 2012, NPR did a story on the White House Boys, men who were sent to the Florida School for Boys in the 50s and 60s and who survived the beatings and torture at that facility. One man who was there during that time reported, "You didn't know when it was coming. These were not spankings. these were beatings, brutal beatings. The man said that he did his best to stay out of trouble. However, he eventually learned about the beatings firsthand. He reported that the school staff got him out of bed at 2 a.m. and took him to the White House, where he says they threw him on a bed, tied his feet, and began beating him with a leather strap. The first blow lifted me 1.5 feet off that bed. He eventually passed out, but another boy in the next room later told him he counted 135 lashes.
The allegations went beyond the physical abuse. Over the years, there were accusations of rape, torture, and even murder of students by staff. Another White House boy interviewed for the NPR story said, "I know of one that I personally saw die in the bathtub that had been beaten half to death. I thought he'd been mauled by the dogs because I thought that he had run. I never did find out the true story on that." He went on to talk about another death. "The boy that I saw who was dead came out of the dryer. They put him in one of those large dryers."
The campus had a cemetery that was known as the Boot Hill Cemetery. Most of the graves were unmarked. Additionally, records for many of the documented 100 students who died at the facility were not kept up appropriately, and there are many lasting questions about which students died and under what circumstances. A 2014 report from an extensive forensic investigation carried out by the University of South Florida beginning in 2011 said that the buried remains of 55 students were located, including many remains found outside the cemetery boundaries, some even in the surrounding woods or brush areas. Florida has been actively trying to identify them, some through the use of DNA. So now back to the 80s. There was an inspection done in 1982 that revealed that the students at the school were hogtied and others were kept in isolation for weeks. The ACLU ended up stepping in and filing a lawsuit in regards to these allegations.
So a lot of disturbing things here so far. Fast forward to 2009, where a report was generated following an investigation by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement at the request of the governor. And they found that there were 81 school-related deaths of students between 1911 and 1973. 31 of these boys were confirmed to be buried on the school grounds, with other bodies supposedly shipped home to families or buried in unknown locations. And this 15-month investigation included over 100 interviews of former students, family members of former students, and former staff members. And then another report was done in 2012 by the University of South Florida that found a total of 98 documented deaths at the school between 1914 and 1973, including the 2 staff members from the fire that was mentioned. This included the use of ground penetrating radar to look for more bodies. Aside from the 31 marked graves, they found dozens more, some with more than one body buried in the same place. So essentially, I don't know if we can call it a mass grave, but they were using the same area to bury multiple kids. And I don't know if that's because they died at the same time or they're like, just digging up that same grave to put the bodies. So in each investigation that was conducted, there was never enough evidence to support the allegations in a way that ever indicated a staff member was absolutely responsible for any student deaths. And astonishingly, the school was only completely closed down in 2011.
Unfortunately, I'm not that surprised, given the state, given the way the state is run. But I would also say that Florida is not the only place in the U.S. where this happens. There are other states with large rural areas that absolutely get away with this type of horrific criminal behavior. Now, in January of this year, 2 memorials were unveiled to recognize the sexual and physical abuse that those children suffered while they were wards of the state more than 50 years ago. One is at the site of the boys' school and one at the state capitol, which is very symbolic in terms of responsibility. Patrick Gillespie, the government official who unveiled the memorial, told the White House boys that were in attendance, the survivors, that it provides a place to reflect and educate the public on the school's history and for us to learn from it. One of the memorials includes a life-size statue of adolescent boys standing in line facing a bed upon which is a leather strap. Behind and off to the side of the bed is an industrial fan. The abuse occurred in what was a converted milking stall. Leading away from the blood-stained bed, 2 boys helped a third walk. It is brutally realistic, but the survivors appreciated that. Survivor 78-year-old Gene Luker told the sculptor, "You really did a good job. That's pretty amazing," as he peered down at the replica beating bed that the artist created. "I wasn't trying to make it look pretty. I was trying to make it look realistic. We're trying to tell a story here," explained the artist.
Yeah, it's very, very haunting and moving.
It should be.
That's what I thought. It absolutely should be. I'll post some pictures when we release this episode. The artist even went so far as, it talks about this blood stain kind of leading away. And it's sculpted, but on the bed, he somehow managed to make like red handprints and then the blood stain as well. And the men, who are all in their like 60s, 70s, 80s who were there really felt that this was done right, which is at least something is done right,
I hope that there was someone there to help them through it as well. I hope that there was consideration for support and talking to them afterwards and the day after and the week after and the month after. I doubt that was done, but this re-triggering, re-exposure to trauma.
I know. So let's turn to some depictions of reform schools in entertainment and particularly films. So there's The Mayor of Hell, which is from 1933, and it's a film starring James Cagney. He plays a character named Patsy, who is an ex-mobster that somehow finagles his way into being a commissioner that oversees a boys' reformatory. And the story starts with 6 young boys who get sent to the reform school after accidentally injuring a store owner during a theft. And James Cagney's character comes in and sees how militaristic and cruel the school is being run. And then he also, as this ex-mobster, clearly identifies with these boys and has a soft spot for them. And he teams up with a very empathetic nurse, the only woman who is on site at this reform school, played by Madge Evans, and makes it a functional, non-punitive place where the boys are empowered, shown respect. They get to elect their own officials. They get to run their own court of law to punish any, little wrongdoings that go on with the boys. Really learning skills, working together. It goes really well. Then the story kind of turns where Patsy gets into some old mob trouble and he has to lay low for a while. And during this time, things go back to the way they were at the reformatory. And he has to come back and intervene at the last moment with the boys before this like Lord of the Flies situation breaks out after one of the boys unfortunately dies due to some punishment that was bestowed on him from the other adult leaders there. But it's, I think for me, this was shown really how reformatories followed like this militaristic way of indoctrinating the boys and having the uniforms and the marching and all of those things, probably more so back then. And I think there are still some, that existed more in more contemporary times, especially with like the drill sergeant piece that we were talking about before. But yeah, definitely a good watch. I mean, it's a quick one. It's an old movie, has James Cagney
1933. And certainly I think that I love how that one focuses or emphasizes sort of how structure from an authoritarian standpoint can be really destructive, but structure from an authoritative and empowering position can be really therapeutic. Like you were talking about, they were able to form their own government and dole out punishment. And I just want to make sure, it's certainly worth watching, but for those that don't watch it, they're not corporally punishing each other as children. They're like, okay, well, that means you don't get to have this activity for a week.
Yeah.
That's going to be
your
no
punishment. More candy bars for 2 weeks because you stole a candy bar. Yeah,
exactly. So in 1996, there was a movie called Sleepers. This one starts out similarly to the previous example with a group of friends from the 1960s Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of NYC. And they had planned to execute a theft and a prank. And of course, it goes horribly wrong. And all of them get sentenced to a reform school. It stars Robert De Niro as the priest from the neighborhood and Kevin Bacon as the main abusive guard. So it's interesting. Kevin Bacon has played an inmate at Alcatraz who's absolutely brutalized by guards. That was like horrible scenes. And then he plays a horrible person in this movie. He's such a good actor. So after some really, really terrible abuse, including the death of one of the boys that they had grown up with, these men, now grown up, seek revenge. And it's Brad Pitt, Jason Patric, Billy Crudup. It also stars Minnie Driver and Dustin Hoffman. It holds up very well. I remember this movie. Agree. It holds up very well. All of them very good actors. There's a great twist in how it comes out. And yeah, they really portray the worst of what we're talking about when, people are given this responsibility and this opportunity to be responsible for young lives, and they take it in a terrible, terrible direction.
Yeah. So this was adapted from a book by the same name by Lorenzo Carcaterra, who maintains that this was based on true events. I was unclear from what I read on whether or not he was one of the boys, but I think that is the implied case.
Okay.
And when questioned about the real events and institutions involved, Lorenzo said, there will be many who question this. First of all, names, dates, and places were changed. Second, institutions raised questions, which I have refused to answer. The bottom line is, it is a true story, and it is my story. Those who choose to believe it have my heart. Those who choose not to believe it, that's for them to decide. So the author maintains that this did take place in New York, although many of the other details have been changed. And the Sacred Heart of Jesus Church and School in New York, which Carcaterra attended, strongly challenged the story because spoiler alert, but in this, Robert De Niro lies to help sort of right some wrongs. He lies in a court of law, right, as a priest. So the real life church that the author was a part of said, nope, that never happened. We never had any priests lie on the stand for anyone.
Of course, because no priests have ever done anything that was criminal. What are you talking about, Dr. Shiloh? You commie?
God, if that was the biggest problem they had to come to terms with, then I'm okay with that. But in addition, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office said there were no records of a case like that described in the book. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, just kind of
look, it feels like there was a lot that was probably made up for this story, or there was a great deal of creative license that was used. But that's not to say that everything that's portrayed in that story has not happened, because it has. It's like when they talk about Game of Thrones, you take away the magic that happens and the dragons, there's nothing in Game of Thrones that has not happened in world history. I mean, it absolutely has. It's interesting. Barry Levinson, who directed the film, was convinced the details were truthful after working so closely with the author for that length of time. And Levinson said, every time I spoke to Lorenzo and I was asking questions about details that I was trying to use in the screenplay, he would just rattle off information. Now, you and I know as forensic psychologists who have interviewed that there is something very interesting about persons who can always come up with more details. That's not necessarily an indication of truth, but this is just a little bit of information that we've been able to pull. We don't know what the full context is. So good movie. I was going to see if you could possibly come up with the most wonderfully terrible and egregious example of a media representation in this genre that stars an actress from one of our other episodes about a particular syndrome. Putting you on the spot, Dr. Shiloh, who and what am I talking about?
Can you give me like a time period of this film?
This was late 70s, early 80s, which was the same time as the other example that we used.
Okay, I'm not looking at the document, but I
changed the font color in the document, and I just highlighted it. She's being so good. She's looking away.
I don't know. It's not coming to me. I'm thinking, was it when we covered The Exorcist? So who was the actress in that? I'm blanking.
Yes, but that's not the episode I was talking about. So it's Linda Blair.
Oh, it is Linda Blair.
Yeah. So basically, LA Not So Confidential has covered now 3 Linda Blair movies. We covered The Exorcist, and then the one with Martin Sheen where she was kidnapped.
God.
And I did the dramatic reading of her monologue.
Yes. Linda, call us.
I know. Oh God, I would love to meet her. Anyway, this actually was like a completely insane movie. And I'm blanking on whether or not it was a TV movie or it was a feature. I'm thinking that it was a TV movie because I'm telling you folks, TV movies in the 70s and 80s were the bomb.
Wild, man.
I mean, they were wild. So this was called Born Innocent. And here is the storyline. A constant runaway is given over to the care of the state and finds herself remanded in a center for girls. She's soon caught between the uncaring bureaucracy, the sometimes brutal treatment from her peers, and her own abusive family. And only one person cares for her, the social worker that she engages. Of course. So it was very exploitative. I mean, very, very, very exploitative, but it was brutal. And I remember as a kid, and this is awful, but this shows how immature we were. we laughed because there's a horrible scene where she's sexually assaulted with a broom handle
Oh my God.
in the prison shower.
I do remember that.
It is brutal. She is screaming. The other actresses are, it's so over the top.
Yeah.
But there was
that one detail makes me recall what this is. Yeah.
So it was very controversial. But again, I wonder, like, okay, are they allowing this to be aired because they're using it as a scare tactic to keep people from running away? I mean, running away was a big deal during the 70s and 80s, as was hitchhiking, because it was a different world. Well, it's the same world. It was just as dangerous, only now we know about it.
Yeah.
But Linda Blair was starring in, she starred in many TV movies at this time. She also did one where a hillbilly witch put a spell on her. I'll have to see if we can find that one for another episode. It was really funny.
I hope Linda Blair got some support and mental health treatment from doing some of these roles so young. Geez.
She seems pretty cool. Like everybody talks about that. She's got a great sense of humor. She's, just this wonderful person. She does the autograph signings that are sort of these conventions around the country where you can like go and get your picture made, and you like have her sign something and you donate money, and all of her money goes to animal rights and pet adoption. How cool is that?
Of course.
That's pretty amazing. So I wanted to give a kind of a more humorous, although the subject itself, it's very controversial for the time, and it was not easy to watch, to the point where I think all the kids my age were having sort of giggles about it, like
nervous,
how brutal it was, because
awkward,
it's so over the top. But this is a phenomenon that has morphed from, a historic time in the 17 and 1800s. We forget that there was this dividing line about the way kids were looked at, or young adults were looked at, or just like, let's just say anyone under the age of like 17, because 18 wasn't like the cutoff for maturity at that time. But if you were living in that time and you stole produce from a farmer, from their field, it was no big deal. It's like, oh, piss off the farmer, but it's kind of a prank and whatever. But if you stole from a vendor or a retailer, that immediately became a criminal case. There's also, in our Puritan history here in the US, you could be put to death by hanging for cursing your parents or striking your parents. Now, there aren't really extant records that show that was carried through a lot, but it did happen a few times. So yes, we have moved forward in some ways, but we still have a long way to go. And it really kind of is a reflection of, especially when you get online, see social media, you'll see like true boomer postings of my dad beat the living shit out of me every night and I'm totally fine and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. It's like, dude, if your dad beat the shit out of you every night, you are not okay. You absolutely are not okay. So, we have now a better understanding of kids are not little adults. And yet at the same time, they are capable of a wide range of thought and consideration and insight and exposure to stimuli in the environment that we all need to be aware of. And we have to think of this in terms of second order change rather than first order change. You just can't fix the system by locking up these alleged criminals and forcing them into a stereotypical mold that we expect to exemplify a good citizen.
Yeah.
This is a case by case issue with an understanding of societal concerns, sociological issues, psychological issues, developmental needs. And that's asking a lot of a public system. But then that's what public systems are for.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, you and I said there's so many branches off of this episode that I really liked. And I liked that it was so kind of concentrated on this phenomenon, but, just juvenile correctional facilities. There are psychologists that work with children, who work with troubled teens, who, this is their bread and butter, where Scott and I are just scraping the surface here of how to really adequately address some of these in a troubled system, like all of our criminal justice system. And that's not to mention, all the wrongful convictions of kids due to coerced confessions.
Exactly.
And issue like the West Memphis 3, and throughout the decades, the different types of cultural and societal issues, like silly issues that society was concerned with, that was totally based on fallacies that led to some of this. So anyway, great episode. I thought this was a really good thing to bring up. So again, thank you so much to Charlie for suggesting it. All those.
Yeah. I feel like this is just scraping the surface, and I would not be surprised if we get a lot of feedback from our listeners and other people because of the additional sort of extension of number of hashtags that will be on the promotion of this. I'm sure we'll get some feedback.
Good. Yeah. All right, everyone. Well, that's all we have for you today. Next week, you will hear our episode on our documentary review, which will be on the anthrax letters. Started the month with domestic terrorism. We're going to end the month with domestic terrorism. So it's 3 episodes. Go ahead and watch that before we all discuss next week. And with that, we'll see you next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Thanks, guys.
Bye, folks.
We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of the Crawlspace Media Network in partnership with Glassbox Media. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
The LA Not So Confidential theme entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons attribution license, and you can check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Instagram at LA Not So Podcast, on Twitter at LA Not So Pod, and on Facebook at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Please join us each month on Saturdays at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for a live streaming and very interactive broadcast on YouTube entitled Behind the Couch. Stay tuned to all of our social media for our live streaming scheduling announcements.
Subscribe to LA Not So Confidential so you never miss a new episode. And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, and you'll be the first notified about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool swag coming your way.
Thanks for listening, and join in with us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Bye, folks.